So we're now in chapter 6, and chapter 6 has to do with food, okay? There's a lot of vocabulary surrounding food and also the accoutrements you use when you're eating, knife, fork, spoon. Um, but what we really want to be focused on in this chapter is the use of the simple past tense. It's known in Spanish as the pretérito, the preterite tense. So up until now, we've learned how to use verbs in the present tense. Okay, we can talk about what's going on now, but how would we say, yesterday I ate lunch? We want to be able to use the simple past or preterite tense. So let's see how we form it. Okay, the pretérito. How do we form it? Now, what I did here is I've given the present tense, the simple present tense, because it's always good to review. And then I've given you, and we're going to look at the preterite tense after that, how to conjugate. So whenever we conjugate a verb in Spanish, we all know this by now, we need to get the stem of the verb. We know that all verbs in Spanish end in either AR, ER, or IR. We get the stem by dropping the AR, ER, IR ending. Okay, and so we're going to get the stem. And when we're conjugating in the present tense, we want to get the stem. And then we know that each subject pronoun has a special ending that goes with it. And so, and we learned those last semester. Well, the preterite form, or the simple past, also forms the same way. We get the stem of the verb, we drop the AR, ER, IR, and then each subject pronoun has a special ending in the preterite tense, and those you have to memorize. And they're very easy to internalize. You just have to work with them a little bit. But let's real quickly look at the present tense in this first column on the left for AR verbs, right? What endings do we add to the stem to form the present tense of AR verbs? So let's take a look. So for yo, we add an O onto the stem, and for nosotros, an AMOS for AR verbs. What about tú? We add an AS ending. And then what about the LA usted form? We add on an A. And then the plural form, ellos, they, we add on an AN. You should all know this. This is just review. And remember, the ustedes form also takes the AN ending. And then let's just review quickly for ER verbs. We get the stem of the ER verb, we drop the ER, and what ending do we add on? For yo, we add on an O, and for nosotros, EMOS, emos. What about tú? We add on an ES, and what about the L form? We add on an E, and for the ellos, ustedes form, we add on an EN. And finally, what about IR verbs? What endings do we add to form the present tense? We add an O on for yo, an IMOS on for nosotros to the stem. For tú, we add on to the stem an ES, and for L, usted, we add on an E to the stem, and for ellos and ustedes, we add on an EN. Very simple. Please look at this and just refamiliarize yourself with it. I mean, we just learned it. Now we want to jump and learn the simple past or the preterite tense. This is what you need to learn now. So when we want to form the preterite tense, we've got to look at our verb. Is it an AR, ER, IR verb? Okay, because we want to form the stem, and we form the stem in the preterite just like we did in the present tense. We drop the AR, ER, and IR ending, and each subject pronoun in the preterite will have a unique, God-given, never-changing ending. Just like in the present tense, there will be one in the preterite tense, and that's what we have to learn. We know how to form the stem of an AR, ER, IR verb, but what we need to learn in chapter 6 is what are the universal endings that correspond to each subject pronoun. Here they are in all their glory. So for yo, I add an E onto the stem, and it will have an accent mark on it. For nosotros, for an AR verb, I will add an AMOS. So really, in the nosotros form, and the present and the preterite forms are exactly the same, but we'll look at that later. What about to? What ending do I add onto the stem? Aste. Aste. You've got to get familiar with these. What about the el, ella, usted form? I add on an O, and notice that O has an accent mark on it. And finally, what about the eos form of an AR verb? What do I add onto the stem to give me the preterite or simple past tense? I add on aron. Aron. There it is. Okay. What about an ER verb? I get the stem. What endings do I add on to form the preterite? For yo, I add in an I, and it's going to have an accent mark on it. Okay. When I write it. What about nosotros? I add on an IMOS, imos. What ending do I add to the to form of an ER verb? What do I add on to the stem to get the preterite or simple past tense? Iste, iste. And then what about the el, ella, usted form? What do I add on to the stem for an ER verb? I add on an io, io. And notice there's an accent mark on the O. Finally, what about the eos form? What do I add on to the stem for an ER verb? I add on ieron, and that would be the same as well for ustedes. Okay. And then finally, let's take a look at IR verbs. It might be a little blocked out here, but what ending do I add to the stem for an IR verb in the yo form? I add on an I again, just like for the ER verbs, I add on an I with an accent mark. What about the nosotros form? I add an IMOS. In fact, that's the same ending as in the present tense. And again, we'll look at that later. What about to? What do I add on for an IR verb? I add on iste. Okay, just like I did for the to of an ER verb. And finally, what about the el, ella, usted form? I add on an io. There it is. E-O, an I-O with an accent mark. So notice that the endings for the ER and IR verbs are exactly the same in the preterite tense for the yo, to, and el form. And then finally, we have the eos form. What is the ending? Again, it's blocked out here. It's going to be ieron, ieron, and it's exactly the same as for the ER verbs. So let's just take a quick look at some conjugations just for review. And also it's good to look at the meanings of these verbs. We're going to be learning some new verbs in chapter 6. You should be familiarizing yourselves with them. So let's look at the present tense conjugation here first. Okay, and the verb we're going to conjugate is gastar. You should all know what it means. It's part of this chapter 6 vocabulary. It means to spend. And we want to conjugate this verb in the present tense, so we have to get the stem, so we drop the AR, and there it is. So let's conjugate it in the present tense, and there it is. Yo gasto. What does it mean? It means I spend, I am spending, I do spend. We have many ways of expressing the present tense in English, and I just wanted you to get that richness. We've talked about this before, and you should know this by now. Okay, let's conjugate it in the to form. It will be tu gastas, you spend, you are spending, or you do spend. And finally, the el form is gasta, el gasta, he spends, is spending, or does spend. Let's look at the plural forms. Nosotros gastamos, we spend. And finally, ellos gastan, they spend. Or we could have ustedes, you all spend. So that's just review. But make sure you know the meaning of the verb gastar and you know how to conjugate it in the present tense. Stem and ending. Now, let's the rubber meet the road here. Now we're going to do a preterite conjugation of an AR verb. So we've got to get the stem of it. So the verb is gastar. What's the stem? We drop the AR. It's gast. So how do I conjugate it? There it is. Yo gasté. What does it mean? I spent or I did spend. In English, we have different ways, again, of expressing the past tense. We could say I spent, or I did spend. What about tu gastaste with the aste end? Okay, so the to form, I put aste onto the end of the stem. Again, you should learn this and become familiar with it. You spent or you did spend. And finally, él gastó. I had an O on the end. He spent or he did spend. Nosotros gastamos. we spent or we did spend. Now notice that the present tense conjugation and the past are exactly the same. How do you know when someone's saying it in the present or the past? It's just the context. So I might use a word like anoche, nosotros gastamos mucho dinero. Last night we spent a lot of money. But right now, ahora, gastamos mucho dinero. Right now we're spending a lot of money. So it's the context. Finally, let's look at the ellos form of an AR verb. I get the stem. What ending do I put on? Aron. And what does ellos gastaron mean? They spent or they did spend. Okay. Let's look at some more verbs here real quickly. Let's do the present tense conjugation of an ER verb. Just the present tense, just to review. So the verb is comer, to eat. I get the stem, it's com. So yo como, I eat, I am eating, I do eat. Tu comes, you are eating, you do eat. Él come, he eats, he does eat. Nosotros comemos, and we eat, we are eating, and ellos comen, they eat, they are eating. Now, this is really, again, what you need to learn. It's understood. You should already know the present tense. But now let's look at the preterite tense. Now we have an ER verb, and it takes unique endings. Okay, so each subject pronoun has a special preterite ending when you're conjugating an ER verb. We must learn these. So for yo, it's an I. Comí. What does yo comí mean? It means I ate or I did eat. So yo como means I eat or I am eating. Yo comí means I ate or I did eat. Stem and ending. Learn those endings. What is the ending for an ER verb in the to form? What do I add to the stem? I add on an iste. Tu comiste means you ate or you did eat. What about the L form? It's going to be an io. Él comió, he ate or he did eat. And notice again, you do have accent marks on these conjugations. In the preterite, in the present tense, we saw very few accent marks when we conjugated in the present tense. Okay, what about nosotros? Stem is com. What ending do I put on? Imos. We ate or did eat, and ellos comieron. Notice the ending here is ieron. Ellos comieron means they ate or they did eat. And finally, let's look at an IR verb. Again, first let's look at the present tense conjugation. This is just pure review. I get the stem of the verb vivir, to live, vive, and I put on my universal God-given endings. What determines the ending? The subject pronoun. And we already know how to conjugate verbs in the present tense, but let's just do a quick review. Yo vivo, I live or am living. Tu vives, you are living or you do live. Él vive, he lives or is living or does live. And nosotros vivimos, we live, we do live, we are living. And finally, ellos viven. Okay, they live, they are living, or do live. Notice again in English, we can describe the present tense in many different ways. That's why I gave you those alternatives, alternate ways of expressing the present tense. Now let's do the preterite tense of an IR verb. We've done an AR, ER. Now let's do an IR verb. We've got to know those endings. Okay, so we know how to get the stem. We drop the IR, so we get vive. Now, what are the endings and what determines the endings? The subject pronoun determines the endings we put on. And again, there's universal endings in the preterite that go with IR verbs. In fact, they're very similar to the endings that go on to ER verbs. Let's take a look. So yo viví, I lived or did live. So we put an I on the end, and notice it has an accent mark. What about the U form? I get the stem, it's vive. What ending goes on IR verbs? It's iste. Tu viviste means you live or you did live. And finally, what if I have the LA form? I get the stem, vive. What ending goes on it? Again, please learn these. It's io, and it's written with an accent. Él vivió is he lived or did live. What about nosotros? We put on an imos ending. We lived, we did live. Notice that the present tense conjugation and the past tense are exactly the same. How do we know which tense we're in? It's just context. So I could just say, nosotros vivimos en Greenville. We live in Greenville. But I could say, el año pasado, last year, nosotros vivimos en Colombia. So it's just the context. And finally, what about the ellos form? What ending do I put on for to get the preterite tense for ellos or for ustedes, vivieron. Okay, ellos vivieron. So please uh, familiarize yourself with these verbs and their endings. So you should be able to put any regular AR, ER, or IR verb into the preterite tense. Please learn these. That's going to be on your exam. It's very simple. You need to practice with it a little bit. Okay, let's take a look at this. I've given you some practice. Let's try to do some of this practice. Okay? ¿Cómo se dice en español? How do you say this in Spanish? And you should know how to respond to these. Let's take a look. Notice that the first one says, it's asking us, how would you say in Spanish, who is paying the bill? Okay? Who is paying the bill? Chapter 6 deals with eating out, not just food, but eating out at restaurants. And we will be learning, make sure you familiarize yourself with the vocabulary. So who is paying the bill? Notice the first question is in the present tense. And to pay, you should know the verb to pay. It's pagar. So let's try to do this. The verb is pagar. It's in the present tense. The subject is who. Okay, it's an AR verb. So we got to get the stem of pagar. It'll be pag. All right. The who form corresponds to the el ella ending. So let's do this one. ¿Quién es who? Paga la cuenta. Please learn that word. La cuenta means the bill when you go out to eat. Who pays the bill, the check, when you go out to eat? ¿Quién paga la cuenta? That's in the present tense. Now, let's try to do this in the preterite. This is what you must learn in this unit. Who paid the bill? So to pay is the verb pagar. The word for bill is cuenta. Let's try to do this one. So who paid the bill? So I got to get the stem of pagar. It's pag. All right. I'm in the el ella form of the verb. So what's the ending that corresponds to el ella or who? It's going to be an o. So let's try it. ¿Quién pagó la cuenta? All right. Who paid the bill? Okay. The next one. How much are you paying for the food? Okay. So this is in the present tense. How much are you paying? ¿Cuánto? A cuánto question. ¿Cuánto pagas por la comida? And the you here I'm using is the familiar you. Generally, when I ask you to use you, I'm referring to the familiar you. ¿Cuánto pagas tú or cuánto pagas por la comida? How much are you paying for the food? Now, let's put that in the preterite. You should be able to put this in the preterite. So we want to get the verb pagar. The stem is pag. And so we have the to form. What ending do I use for an AR verb when I want to put the verb in the preterite or past tense? Aste. So, ¿cuánto pagaste por la comida? How much did you spend or on the food? Or did you pay for the food? Okay. Why are you eating my salad? Again, this is just in the present tense, and it should be my salad with a Y, but let's try this. How do you say why? ¿Por qué? To eat is comer. So why are you eating? I want it in the present tense. So it's ¿por qué comes mis ensalada? Now, how would you put that in the preterite? You should be able to do this now automatically. I've got the verb comer. I've got it in the to form. The you I'm using is to. So the stem is com. What ending goes on an ER verb in the preterite tense? What's the ending that corresponds to to? Iste. ¿Por qué comiste mi ensalada? Why did you eat my salad? And then I did another sentence in the present tense. Again, just to juxtapose the present with the preterite. Which fruit are we buying? What's the verb to buy? Comprar. Okay. So which verb are we buying? So, ¿qué fruta compramos? Which verb are we buying? So this is in the present. Now let's put it in the past tense, in the preterite tense. So the verb is comprar. The stem is compra. What ending do what is my preterite ending for nosotros? It's ambos. It's exactly the same. So, ¿qué fruta compramos? They both mean It just depends on context. Que fruta compramos? What fruit are we buying right now? You might be in a store, or someone might say to you, anoche, last night, que fruta compramos? What fruit did we buy? Okay, so please familiarize yourself with the preterite tense of the AR, ER, and IR verbs. And you get the stem of the verb, you drop the AR, ER, and IR, and then the subject pronoun will determine the preterite ending you put on the verb. You just have to learn those endings. So you have to spend a little bit of time with these, but after a while it becomes very easy. Thank you.